Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
It has been 10 years since the Bastille fell. We chanted, we marched, we fought for liberty. And now, the streets are quiet, the guillotine still, and a man from Corsica walks into power. My name is Laurent Durant. I sold books and once believed in them. Now I watch as history rewrites itself in the uniform of a general, and wonder if this is how all revolutions end. My name is Laurent Durant, and I have been selling books in Paris for 23 years. Today is the 18th of Brumaire, year 8 of the Republic, though I suspect that calendar may not survive much longer. The autumn rain taps against my shop window like impatient fingers, and I find myself counting the empty spaces where volumes once stood. 10 years ago, this shop overflowed with revolutionary pamphlets. What is the Third Estate? By Abbé Sieyès, sold faster than I could restock them. Citizens would gather outside my door, arguing about Rousseau and Voltaire until the early hours. The air itself seemed to crackle with possibility then. Now the silence feels heavier than the rain clouds gathering over the Seine. I remember the morning of July 14th, 1789, when young Etienne burst through my door, his printer's ink still wet on his fingers. "Laurent," he cried, "they're marching on the Bastille, the whole city is alive." He grabbed a stack of revolutionary broadsides from my counter, pressed a few sous into my palm and ran back into the street. Those were the days when words had power, when a single pamphlet could topple a government, when citizens believed they could reshape the world with reason and righteousness. I sold Marat's L'Ami du Peuple by the hundreds, each copy passed from hand to hand like a sacred text. The ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, they burned bright in every page. But ideas, I have learned, are fragile things. They require careful tending, like rare books in a damp cellar. And Paris has been so very damp these past few years. The shelves that once held Marat's fiery words now display dusty volumes of poetry and philosophy, safe, neutral works that offend no one and inspire little. After Thermidor, after Robespierre's head rolled into the same basket that had claimed the king and queen, a great exhaustion settled over the city like fog from the river. I was here the day they announced Robespierre's execution, July 28th, 1794. The crowds that gathered were different from those early revolutionary days, not jubilant, not even particularly angry, just tired, so terribly tired. A woman next to me in the street, her dress faded and her face gaunt, simply said, "At least it's over." But was it? Or had something else just begun? The Directory promised stability, order, a return to reason. Citizens would govern themselves through elected representatives, they said. No more kings, but no more terror either. For a while, I believed them. I stocked my shelves with constitutional texts, treatises on republican government, histories of ancient Rome. Surely, I thought, we were entering an age of enlightened democracy. But the Directory's promises proved as fragile as morning frost. Corruption seeped into every corner of government like water through cracked stone. Elections were annulled when the results displeased those in power. The press, once our proudest weapon against tyranny, found itself muzzled again. My customers stopped asking for political works. Why read about liberty when it could mark you as a troublemaker? I began to notice how people walked differently in those days. Heads down, eyes averted, shoulders hunched, against more than just the cold. We had traded the guillotine's blade for a subtler kind of fear, the fear of being noticed, of standing out, of remembering too clearly what we had once dared to dream. The wars, of course, never stopped. Even as we told ourselves we were building a republic of peace and reason, French armies marched across Europe. At first we called it defense, protecting the revolution from foreign monarchs who would crush our infant democracy. The young men who left Paris sang the Marseillaise with fire in their voices, convinced they carried liberty to the oppressed masses of Europe. But defense became conquest, and conquest became something else entirely. I began to hear stories from the letters that came back, stories of plunder and tribute, of republics imposed at bayonet point. The Italy campaign brought gold, flowing back to Paris, but also brought whispers of a young general who seemed to win every battle he fought. Bonaparte. Even his name sounded foreign on Parisian tongues, Corsican and sharp. The newspapers, what remained of them, began to print his dispatches from the front. Victory at Lodi, triumph at Rivoli, the conquest of Venice. Each success made the directory seem smaller, more provincial, more obviously inadequate. I remember the day I received a shipment of books from Lyon. Hidden among the volumes was a pamphlet, crudely printed, probably illegal, titled The New Caesar. It spoke of Bonaparte's growing popularity among the soldiers, his contempt for the squabbling politicians in Paris, his alleged ambitions for supreme power. I should have burned it immediately. Instead, I hid it beneath my counter and found myself reading it again and again by candlelight. The pamphlet asked questions I had been afraid to voice. What was the difference between a directory that ignored elections and a monarchy that ignored parliament? Between a republic that ruled by fear and an empire that ruled by strength? If liberty meant chaos and equality meant mediocrity, what did fraternity mean when brothers turned on each other with such savage regularity? Egypt, the land of pharaohs and pyramids, of ancient mysteries and forgotten wisdom. For a moment, the old revolutionary enthusiasm flickered back to life in my shop. Citizens came seeking maps of the Nile, histories of Alexander the Great, anything that might help them understand this mad expedition to the edge of the world. I sold out of Volney's voyage en Syrie et en Egypte within days. Even the most cynical Parisians seemed caught up in the romance of it. French soldiers marching in the footsteps of Alexander, French scholars unlocking the secrets of the ancients. But romance, like revolution, rarely survives contact with reality. The first reports spoke of dazzling victories, of the pyramids themselves witnessing French triumph. But then came whispers of plague, of an army stranded by Nelson's destruction of the French fleet, of soldiers dying in the desert sand, far from the cafes and boulevards of home. I began to suspect that Egypt was less a destination than an escape. Bonaparte, for all his genius, had perhaps grown tired of the Directory's limitations of governing through committees and compromises. In Egypt, he could be more than a general. He could be a pharaoh, absolute and undisputed. The scholars he brought were not just archaeologists but propagandists, crafting an image of Bonaparte as heir to Alexander and Caesar both. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Directory stumbled from crisis to crisis. The treasury was empty despite the Italian plunder. The elections of 1798 had required another purge to keep the wrong candidates from taking office. The newspapers spoke of foreign conspiracies and domestic treachery, but mostly they spoke of uncertainty. No one seemed to know what the Republic stood for anymore, only what it stood against. News from Egypt came in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that reflected only partial truths. Bonaparte's bulletins spoke of French soldiers studying hieroglyphs between battles, of the marriage of French reason and ancient wisdom creating something entirely new. The reality, I suspected, was sand and sickness, and the slow realization that conquering the past was easier than governing the present. But the image of Bonaparte was changing in those Egyptian dispatches. No longer just a successful general, he was becoming something more mythical, a figure who moved between worlds, who commanded not just armies but the very stones of antiquity. When reports arrived of his victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, the city seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers, his proclamation read, 40 centuries of history look down upon you. I found myself wondering if Bonaparte had planned this transformation all along. Egypt was not just a military campaign, but a theatrical performance, with the whole of history as a stage. While the Directory bickered over budget allocations and electoral procedures, Bonaparte was writing himself into legend. The scholars who accompanied him, the savants as they called themselves, sent back not just military dispatches but cultural treasures, reports of the discovery of ancient texts, of monuments that predated Christ, of a stone covered in 3 scripts that might unlock the language of pharaohs. Knowledge became conquest, and conquest became legitimacy. I began to stock my shelves with anything related to ancient history. Plutarch's Lives sold particularly well. Citizens wanted to read about Caesar and Alexander, about strong men who had shaped the world through will and genius, rather than committees and constitutions. The first rumors of Bonaparte's return reached Paris in early autumn. Not official dispatches, but whispers carried by merchants and travelers, stories that spread through the city like smoke from a distant fire. He had abandoned his army, they said, slipped away in the night with only his closest supporters, leaving his soldiers to make their own way home from the desert. At first, the Directory tried to portray this as desertion, if not outright treason. But the whispers grew stronger, and they carried a different message. Bonaparte had not fled Egypt. He had transcended it. He was bringing back something more valuable than gold or territory. He was bringing back the promise of order, of strength, of an end to the uncertainty that had plagued France for 10 years. I found myself caught between fear and anticipation. The bookseller in me recognized the power of a well-crafted narrative, and Bonaparte's story was compelling beyond measure. The citizen in me remembered what we had fought for in 1789, what we had died for in the years that followed. But the man in me, the tired Parisian who had watched a decade of dreams turn to ash, found himself wondering if perhaps it was time for something different. I began to notice how people spoke of Bonaparte in those days, not as a general or even as a citizen, but as a force of nature, inevitable, unstoppable, perhaps necessary. The revolution had taught us that history could be made by ordinary people with extraordinary courage, but perhaps we had learned the wrong lesson. Perhaps history was made by extraordinary people with ordinary ambition. October brought more than falling leaves to Paris. It brought whispers, rumors, the kind of hushed conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Bonaparte had indeed returned, though the Directory tried to keep his arrival quiet. Too late. The city already knew, as cities always know when something momentous stirs beneath the surface of ordinary life. I began to see them in my shop. Men I didn't recognize, well-dressed but careful, browsing my shelves with the kind of attention that suggested they were looking for more than books. They asked casual questions about my customers, my inventory, my thoughts on current events. I answered carefully, mindful that in times of change, today's casual conversation becomes tomorrow's evidence. The directory, desperate to maintain some semblance of control, appointed Bonaparte to command of the Army of the Interior. A position of honor, they called it, though everyone understood it was meant to keep him busy with ceremonial duties while the real power remained in their hands. But Bonaparte was not a man to be confined by ceremony. I remember the morning I saw him for the first time. I was walking to my shop when a carriage passed, and through the window I glimpsed a pale face, dark hair, eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The crowd on the street parted without being asked, not from fear, but from some instinctive recognition that they were in the presence of destiny. That afternoon a young man entered my shop. Well-spoken, expensive clothes, the kind of careful confidence that marked him as someone accustomed to influence. He purchased a copy of Plutarch's Caesar and paid with a gold coin that was worth 3 times the book's price. As he left, he mentioned that he represented certain interests that might have need of a discreet bookseller's services. Nothing treasonous, of course, simply the kind of communication that men of affairs sometimes required. I said nothing, but I kept the gold coin, not because I needed it, but because I recognized it as a token, a sign that I had been noticed, evaluated, perhaps recruited. The machinery of conspiracy, I realized, was already in motion. CAS came to see me on a Tuesday evening in late October. The same Abbé CAS whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, had helped ignite the revolution 10 years before. Now he was a director himself, one of the 5 men who officially governed France, and he looked every day of the decade that had passed since I had first sold his revolutionary words. Laurent, he said, settling into the chair I kept for elderly customers, you have an interesting establishment here. Books that remember the past, customers who shape the future. He picked up a volume of Montesquieu, thumbed through its pages with the practiced gesture of a man who had spent his life among books. Tell me, what do you make of our current circumstances? I chose my words carefully. I sell books, citizen. I try to avoid politics. He smiled, a thin, knowing expression that suggested he found my caution amusing rather than convincing. My dear Laurent, in times like these there is no avoiding politics. The question is whether we shape events or allow events to shape us. CAS spoke carefully, circling his meaning like a cat around a dish of cream. The directory, he suggested, had lost the confidence of the people. The constitution of year 3 was flawed, perhaps fatally so. What France needed was not another revolution, but a revision, a careful adjustment of the machinery of government to make it more efficient, more responsive to the will of the nation. And for such a revision to succeed, it would need the support of the army, the backing of public opinion, and the leadership of someone who commanded respect both at home and abroad. Someone like, perhaps, General Bonaparte. I listened, understanding that I was being sounded out for my willingness to participate in whatever was being planned. My shop, with its steady stream of customers from all levels of society, would be useful for spreading certain messages, for gauging public sentiment, for facilitating the kind of communications that could not be trusted to official channels. When CAS left, he bought a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince. Another token, another sign. I was being invited to join the conspiracy, not because they needed me, but because they wanted to test my loyalty. In the great game being played, I was not a player, but a piece, valuable enough to cultivate, expendable enough to sacrifice. Bonaparte himself came to my shop 3 days before Brumaire. Not in the grand carriage I had seen before, but on foot, dressed simply, accompanied only by a single aide. He moved through my shop like he moved through everything else, with absolute confidence, as if the space had been created specifically for his use. "You have an excellent selection," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as foreign, but had somehow become part of his charm. "I'm particularly interested in books about Rome, the late Republic specifically." I showed him my collection of classical histories, Tacitus, Suetonius, Caesar's own commentaries. He handled them with genuine interest, not the performance of a man trying to appear learned, but the focus of someone who actually was. When he spoke of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, of Augustus's careful transformation of republic into empire, I realized he was not just reading history but studying it as a manual. "The Romans understood something we have forgotten," he said, setting down a volume of Livy. "That liberty without order is chaos, and order without authority is impossible. The Directory has given us neither liberty nor order. Perhaps it is time for a different approach." Before he left, he purchased a small leather-bound edition of Plutarch's Lives. As he paid, with ordinary coins, not the gold tokens his agents had used, he looked at me directly. "Citizen Laurent," he said, "tomorrow begins a new chapter in our nation's story. I trust you will help ensure it is written correctly." That night, I stayed awake long past my usual bedtime, sitting in my shop surrounded by books that had witnessed the rise and fall of republics, the birth and death of empires. Outside, Paris slept fitfully, unaware that its fate was about to be decided by a handful of conspirators and a Corsican general who had learned to read history like a battle map. November 9th, Year 8 of the Republic. The morning broke grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes Paris feel older than its years. I opened my shop as usual, though I suspected this would be anything but a usual day. The streets were quieter than normal, with fewer vendors and an unusual number of well-dressed men walking with purpose toward the government buildings. By noon, the rumors had begun to spread. Something was happening at Saint-Cloud, where the Council of 500 had been persuaded to meet in emergency session. Sieyès and his fellow conspirators had convinced the legislators that a Jacobin plot threatened the Republic, that only extraordinary measures could preserve the Constitution. Of course, the greatest threat to the Constitution was sitting in the council chamber itself. But such ironies are only obvious in retrospect. A young woman entered my shop that afternoon, her clothes marking her as a seamstress or shopkeeper's daughter. She seemed nervous, glancing frequently at the door as she browsed my shelves. Finally, she approached my counter with a book of poetry. "Citizen," she said quietly, "my father works in the government offices. He says the deputies are trapped at Saint-Cloud, surrounded by soldiers. He says General Bonaparte has taken control of the guards." She paused, her hands shaking slightly as she counted out coins for the book. "Is it true what they're saying? That we're getting a new government?" I took her money and wrapped the book carefully, buying time to consider my response. "The government changes, citizeness, but France endures. Your father should be careful to avoid taking sides until the dust settles." She nodded and left quickly, clutching her book like a talisman. but her question echoed in my mind. Were we getting a new government, or simply a new master? The official news came at evening, delivered by heralds who read from hastily printed proclamations in the grey light of November dusk. The Directory had been dissolved. The Constitution had been suspended. A provisional government of 3 consuls would govern France until new arrangements could be made. Citizen Bonaparte, by unanimous acclaim of the legislative councils, would serve as first consul. Unanimous acclaim. I had seen enough of politics to know what that phrase meant. The deputies at Saint-Cloud had been given a choice: acclaim or exile, cooperation or consequences. Bonaparte had learned well from the Roman histories in my shop. Like Caesar before him, he preferred to obtain power legally when possible, by force when necessary. The crowd that gathered to hear the proclamation was neither jubilant nor hostile, merely attentive, like spectators at a play waiting to see how the story would end. 10 years of revolution had taught Parisians to be wary of dramatic proclamations. We'd heard promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity before. We'd also heard promises of order, prosperity, and peace. Words were cheap. Only time would reveal their true value. An old man standing next to me in the crowd, I recognized him as a customer who often bought Republican pamphlets, shook his head slowly. "So ends the Republic," he murmured. 18 years since the king fell, and we crown ourselves a new one. "Perhaps," I replied, "or perhaps we simply find new words for old things. The Romans called Augustus an emperor, but he preferred to be known as first citizen. Names matter less than deeds." The old man looked at me sharply. "You sound like you approve of this coup." "I approve of nothing yet," I said carefully. "But I've learned that disapproval without power is merely noise. Let us see what Citizen Bonaparte does with the power he has taken." Within days, the change was visible throughout Paris. The inefficiency that had marked the Directory's rule, the confusion, the corruption, the constant political maneuvering, began to disappear. Orders were given and followed. Decisions were made and implemented. The machinery of government, so long broken down and unreliable, suddenly began to work with smooth efficiency. Bonaparte established himself not in the royal palace but in more modest quarters, emphasizing his role as servant of the people rather than their master. He met with delegations from every sector of society: merchants, workers, scholars, soldiers, listening to their concerns and making practical promises. Not grand revolutionary pledges, but specific commitments. Roads would be repaired, taxes collected fairly, brigands suppressed, trade protected. I found myself impressed despite my reservations. This was not the chaotic enthusiasm of 1789 or the bloody fanaticism of 1793, but something more mature, the promise of competent governance by people who understood the difference between slogans and solutions. The books I sold began to change as well. Fewer political treatises, more practical works on administration, engineering, law. Citizens were no longer interested in theories of government, but in the actual mechanics of making society function. Bonaparte's government encouraged this shift, promoting technical education and scientific research while discouraging political speculation. Yet something bothered me about this new efficiency. In my 23 years as a bookseller, I had learned that the most dangerous governments were not the chaotic ones, but the competent ones. Incompetent tyrants fall quickly, competent ones endure for generations. And Bonaparte, whatever else he might be, was undeniably competent. Winter settled over Paris like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it a sense of stability the city had not known for years. The new consular government moved with the precision of a well-made clock, each department functioning smoothly in service of the whole. Laws were passed and enforced, public works projects began, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, France began to feel like a nation again, rather than a collection of quarrelling factions. Bonaparte visited my shop again in December, this time openly, with a small entourage of officials and secretaries. He was no longer the conspiratorial general of November, but the first consul of France, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had found his proper place in the world. "Citizen Laurent," he said, surveying my shelves with approval, "I trust you are finding the new regime conducive to business?" "Indeed, Citizen Consul. People are reading again, thinking about the future rather than merely surviving the present." He smiled at that, a genuine expression of pleasure. "Precisely. We've had enough of ideology, enough of abstract principles that mean nothing to ordinary citizens. What France needs now is practical governance based on merit, efficiency, and results." He spoke of his plans for the country, a new legal code that would synthesize the best of revolutionary law with practical tradition, public schools that would educate citizens rather than indoctrinate them, roads and bridges that would unite the nation physically as well as politically. It was an inspiring vision, and he presented it with the kind of detail that suggested he had thought deeply about every aspect. But as he spoke, I noticed something that disturbed me. He never mentioned the legislature except in passing, never discussed the role of elected representatives in shaping these policies. His vision was thoroughly administrative, the government as a great machine with himself as the engineer who kept it running smoothly. When he left, he purchased a multi-volume set of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. "To understand how to preserve what we have built," he explained. But I wondered if he was studying the fall of Rome or the rise of its emperors. Spring brought news that confirmed my growing suspicions. A new constitution was being prepared, the constitution of Year 8, and it would be submitted to the people for approval by plebiscite. Democracy, Bonaparte explained, but democracy guided by wisdom and experience rather than the chaos of unlimited debate. I obtained an advance copy of the Constitution through my network of customers in the government offices. Reading it by candlelight in my shop, I began to understand the architecture of what Bonaparte was building. The forms of republican government were preserved. There would still be legislative bodies, still be elections, still be the appearance of popular sovereignty. But the substance had been quietly transformed. Real power would rest with the first consul, who would appoint ministers, propose laws, control the army, and direct foreign policy. The legislature would debate and vote, but only on proposals submitted by the executive. The people would elect representatives, but from lists of candidates pre-approved by the government. It was brilliant in its way, a system that provided the efficiency of monarchy with the legitimacy of democracy. Citizens would feel they had a voice in government while ensuring that voice could never speak loudly enough to disturb the harmony of the whole. Napoleon had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued the revolution: how to reconcile liberty with order, equality with hierarchy, fraternity with authority. The plebiscite was held in early spring, and the results were overwhelming. More than 3 million votes in favor, fewer than 2,000 opposed. Whether these numbers reflected genuine enthusiasm or careful management was impossible to determine, but it hardly mattered. Bonaparte now had not just power, but legitimacy, not just authority, but consent. As summer arrived, I found myself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. My shop continued to prosper under the new regime. Citizens had money to spend on books, and the government actively encouraged learning and cultural development. The streets were safer, trade was expanding, and France was at peace with most of its neighbors. By any practical measure, the consulate was succeeding where the directory had failed. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something precious had been lost in the transformation. The passionate debates that had once filled my shop were gone, replaced by polite discussions of approved topics. Citizens still read, but they read what they were encouraged to read. They still thought, but they thought along channels carved by others. I began to notice how language itself was changing under the new regime. Words like liberty and equality were still used, but their meanings had subtly shifted. Liberty now meant the freedom to prosper under wise guidance. Equality meant equal opportunity to serve the state according to one's abilities. Fraternity meant unity behind the common cause of French greatness. A regular customer, a young lawyer named Henri, whom I had known since the early days of the Revolution, stopped by one evening as I was closing. He had been one of the most ardent Republicans in 1789, full of fire for the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people. Now he worked in the Ministry of Justice, helping to draft the new legal code. "Laurent," he said, "I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your face every time Bonaparte's name is mentioned. You think we've betrayed everything we fought for." I finished locking my cash box before answering. "Have we?" "We've grown up," he replied. "We've learned that governing is harder than revolting, that building is harder than destroying. Bonaparte isn't perfect, but he's competent, and competence in government is a rarer virtue than righteousness." Henri picked up a book I had displayed prominently, Rousseau's Social Contract, and weighed it in his hands. I used to think this was the most important book ever written. The idea that legitimate government derives from the consent of the governed seemed like the key to human freedom. And now I think Rousseau was half right. Government does need consent, but consent isn't enough. It also needs wisdom, experience, and the courage to make difficult decisions. Maybe that's what Bonaparte represents, not the end of the revolution, but its maturation. After Henri left, I remained in my shop long into the night, surrounded by the books that had chronicled humanity's endless struggle to balance freedom with order. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the revolution had not failed, but simply evolved, trading the chaos of unlimited possibility for the satisfaction of limited but genuine achievement. Or perhaps we had simply grown tired of the burden of self-governance and were ready to let someone else carry the load. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something precious had been lost in the transformation. The passionate debates that had once filled my shop were gone, replaced by polite discussions of approved topics. Citizens still read, but they read what they were encouraged to read. They still thought, but they thought along channels carved by others. I began to notice how language itself was changing under the new regime. Words like liberty and equality were still used, but their meanings had subtly shifted. Liberty now meant the freedom to prosper under wise guidance. Equality meant equal opportunity to serve the state according to one's abilities. Fraternity meant unity behind the common cause of French greatness. A regular customer, a young lawyer named Henri, whom I had known since the early days of the Revolution, stopped by one evening as I was closing. He had been one of the most ardent Republicans in 1789, full of fire for the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people. Now he worked in the Ministry of Justice, helping to draft the new legal code. "Laurent," he said, "I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your face every time Bonaparte's name is mentioned. You think, yet I could not shake the feeling that something precious had been lost in the transformation. The passionate debates that had once filled my shop were gone, replaced by polite discussions of approved topics. Citizens still read, but they read what they were encouraged to read. They still thought, but they thought along channels carved by others. I began to notice how language itself was changing under the new regime. Words like liberty and equality were still used, but their meanings had subtly shifted. Liberty now meant the freedom to prosper under wise guidance. Equality meant equal opportunity to serve the state according to one's abilities. Fraternity meant unity behind the common cause of French greatness. A regular customer, a young lawyer named Henri, whom I had known since the early days of the Revolution, stopped by one evening as I was closing. He had been one of the most ardent Republicans in 1789, full of fire for the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people. Now he worked in the Ministry of Justice, helping to draft the new legal code. "Laurent," he said, "I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your face every time Bonaparte's name is mentioned. You think we've betrayed everything." He smiled at that, a genuine expression of pleasure. "Precisely. We've had enough of ideology, enough of abstract principles that mean nothing to ordinary citizens. What France needs now is practical governance based on merit, efficiency, and results." He spoke of his plans for the country, a new legal code that would synthesize the best of revolutionary law with practical tradition, public schools that would educate citizens rather than indoctrinate them, roads and bridges that would unite the nation physically as well as politically. It was an inspiring vision, and he presented it with the kind of detail that suggested he had thought deeply about every aspect. But as he spoke, I noticed something that disturbed me. He never mentioned the legislature except in passing, never discussed the role of elected representatives in shaping these policies. His vision was thoroughly administrative, the government as a great machine with himself as the engineer who kept it running smoothly. When he left, he purchased a multi-volume set of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. "To understand how to preserve what we have built," he explained. But I wondered if he was studying the fall of Rome or the rise of its... It was brilliant in its way, a system that provided the efficiency of monarchy with the legitimacy of democracy. Citizens would feel they had a voice in government while ensuring that voice could never speak loudly enough to disturb the harmony of the whole. Napoleon had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued the revolution: how to reconcile liberty with order, equality with hierarchy, fraternity with authority. The plebiscite was held in early spring, and the results were overwhelming. More than 3 million votes in favor, fewer than 2,000 opposed. Whether these numbers reflected genuine enthusiasm or careful management was impossible to determine, but it hardly mattered. Bonaparte now had not just power, but legitimacy, not just authority, but consent. As summer arrived, I found myself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. My shop continued to prosper under the new regime. Citizens had money to spend on books, and the government actively encouraged learning and cultural development. The streets were safer, trade was expanding, and France was at peace. It was brilliant in its way, a system that provided the efficiency of monarchy with the legitimacy of democracy. Citizens would feel they had a voice in government while ensuring that voice could never speak loudly enough to disturb the harmony of the whole. Napoleon had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued the revolution: how to reconcile liberty with order, equality with hierarchy, fraternity with authority. The plebiscite was held in early spring, and the results were overwhelming. More than 3 million votes in favor, fewer than 2,000 opposed. Whether these numbers reflected genuine enthusiasm or careful management was impossible to determine, but it hardly mattered. Bonaparte now had not just power, but legitimacy, not just authority, but consent. As summer arrived, I found myself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. My shop continued to prosper under the new regime. Citizens had money to spend on books, and the government actively encouraged learning and cultural development. The streets were safer, trade was 5 years have passed since I began this account, and much has changed in France. The consulate has become an empire, and Bonaparte has traded his republican title for an imperial crown. The transformation that began on the 18th Brumaire has reached its logical conclusion. We have our new monarch, dressed in the purple of Caesar and blessed by the church that once condemned our revolution. Yet my shop remains much the same. Citizens still come seeking knowledge, wisdom, escape from the weight of daily life. They buy books about history and science, poetry and philosophy, stories that help them make sense of their world or forget it entirely. The fundamental human hunger for understanding remains constant, regardless of who sits on the throne or what title they claim. I am older now, greyer, more aware of my own mortality. The young men who once gathered in my shop to debate the future of democracy are scattered. Some dead on foreign battlefields, some grown wealthy in imperial service, some simply worn down by the passage of time and the weight of compromise. The revolution that began with such hope and passion has become, for most of us, simply another chapter in our personal histories. But the books remain. On my shelves sit the same volumes that witnessed the fall of the Bastille and the rise of Napoleon, the same ideas that inspired both the Declaration of Rights and the Code Civil. Future generations will read these books and draw their own conclusions about what we attempted, what we achieved, and what we failed to understand. Perhaps they will judge us harshly for our inability to sustain the democratic experiment we began. Perhaps they will praise us for our willingness to trade chaos for order when the choice became necessary. Or perhaps they will simply see us as human beings doing our best to navigate the impossible tension between freedom and security, between idealism and pragmatism, between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. I am, in the end, just a bookseller, a curator of other people's thoughts, a facilitator of other people's dreams. I have witnessed one of history's great transformations from the peculiar vantage point of a man who sells ideas for a living. I have watched citizens become subjects, revolutionaries become administrators, and dreams become policies. The autumn rain still taps against my window, as it did on that November day when Bonaparte first marched toward power. The leaves still fall along the Seine, indifferent to our human struggles. And somewhere in my shop, gathering dust but not forgotten, sits a worn copy of What is the Third Estate? A reminder that even the most powerful empires begin with someone asking dangerous questions about the world they inhabit. Perhaps that, more than any particular form of government, is what we should preserve. The right to ask questions, to seek answers, to dream of something better than what we have inherited. Empires rise and fall, constitutions are written and rewritten, but the human spirit that drove us to storm the Bastille and proclaim the rights of man, that spirit endures, waiting for its next opportunity to reshape the world. Until then, I remain what I have always been, Laurent Durant, bookseller of Paris, keeper of stories, guardian of the dreams that refuse to die. The tricolor still flies, the statues still stand, but the words we once whispered in cafes, liberty, fraternity, they echo now through arches built by emperors. I remember the revolution, and I wonder if it remembers us.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.